It's Debbie. I am back with more true crime of Criminal Minds. How's everybody doing? Today we are going to continue the story of Fred and Rosemary West. In case you missed the other episode or you just don't want to go back and watch it, I have a small recap. Fred and Rosemary West were a serial killer couple that killed 12 women in England, 2 of which were Fred's daughters. Both of them were essayed by their parents growing up and thought it was totally normal and how that's how families routinely did things. Both had suffered physical traumas. Fred had 2 head injuries at a young age, and Rosemary's mother received electroshock therapy in a mental institution while she was pregnant with Rose, and as a result, Rose was slow. Fred married Rena, and they had Charmaine and Anna Marie before he met Rosemary. Rena was his first wife. Charmaine was their first child, but she was actually not Fred's biological daughter. She was a daughter of one of Rena's clients. Fred took jobs that allowed him to look for women. He drove a bakery truck, he drove an ice cream truck, anything that would keep him mobile so he could drive around and hunt. And he drove, when he was married to Rena, he drove an ice cream truck. And unfortunately, he hit and killed a small boy. And after that, he couldn't make any more money with the ice cream truck. When we ended the story last time, he was separated from Rena, and he had met Rosemary Letts, who was 12 years younger than him, and her father did not approve. He put her in a home for troubled teens, but Fred went and took her out, and she went home to live with him. Now, it's an extremely bizarre story. Her father did not approve, but later he's going to be pretty happy about the whole thing. So, there's your recap. Now we're going to get into the details of the rest of the story. Stick around. Fred and Rosemary's daughter Heather was born on October 17th, 1970. Fred had been stealing from the construction site where he worked, and he was arrested. So now Rosemary is at home alone with 3 kids to take care of all by herself, and she's not even really adult yet either. She hated Charmaine and would beat her all the time, and Charmaine wouldn't cry, and when she didn't cry, then Rosemary would just beat her more. On March 28th, 1971, Charmaine was taken to the hospital for a puncture wound in her heel. After that, Charmaine was never seen again. Fred was in jail at the time, but the authorities thought that they had planned it together. When Fred was released from prison, when he went home, he dismembered Charmaine and buried her in the yard at the Midland Road flat where they lived. In August of 1971, Rena came back looking for her girls. Fred said he couldn't tell her where Charmaine was. He had to take her to Charmaine. So he drove her to a pub, got her drunk, then strangled her, took her back to his flat, dismembered her, and then drove her out to the field where Anne McFall had been buried. And when they finally found her remains, there was a lead pipe in her throat and a boomerang beside her. And I do not want to know what he did with that boomerang. Fred and Rosemary were secretly married in 1972. And I don't know why it was a secret unless her dad still disapproved. But he's not going to disapprove for long. The couple wanted to have more children, so they needed to move to a bigger house. So they went to 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucestershire, and they bought a 3-story house. And the top floor was renovated so they could take in boarders. And the house had a cellar, which Fred converted to a torture chamber. Rosemary became a sex worker and worked out of their house, and Fred was her pimp. She liked sadistic sex, and Fred liked to watch, so he drew peepholes in the walls of her room so he could watch. He also set up a baby monitor so he could hear her with her clients anywhere in the house that he wanted to hear it. He put a red light on the porch light. He took pictures of her and submitted them to magazines as advertisement, and he would just ask people, do you want to sleep with my wife? And the most bizarre thing of the entire story, in my opinion, I mean, the whole thing's horrible, but her dad was her most frequent client, and he actually fathered one of her children. Fred had a total of 10 children. Charmaine and Anna Marie were his children with Rena. Charmin was his adopted daughter, not his biological daughter. He and Rosemary had Heather and May, and after those two, Rosemary had Stephen, Tara, Louise, Barry, Rosemary Jr., and Luciana. Of the last six, only two were Fred's biological children. One of them was her father's, and three of them were from her clients, and they knew that because they were mixed race. In November of 1972, they picked up 17-year-old Carolyn Owens. She liked them very much, and the friendship was mutual. The Wests asked her to be their nanny, and she moved in with them. I guess Anna Marie tried to make Carolyn a confidant because they shared a room, and told her about all of the SA that she was getting from her parents. And Caroline mentioned it to Fred, and Fred said, oh no, she lost her virginity when she fell off a bike. That's not how that happens, y'all. Yes, you can be injured down there by falling off of a bike, but that has nothing to do with virginity. Carolyn had a three-way with Rosemary and Fred, and then she started to feel uncomfortable. So she left about 2 months later. And Fred and Rose would go out looking for her. And one night they found her when she was walking back from her boyfriend's house, and they offered her a ride home. So she got in the car. Rosemary was in the back seat. Rosemary apologized to her for what? I have no idea. I guess whatever caused her to want to not live there anymore. So Rose apologized to her, and they took her back to the cellar where she was essayed and tortured for 12 hours. And there was a knock on the door. So Fred went to see who was at the door, and Carolyn called out for help. So Rosemary put a pillow over her face, and Caroline was able to tell Rosemary she's sorry and she wouldn't do it again. And so she took the pillow away from her face, and she survived. And they actually let her go home the next day. So Caroline went straight home to her mom, told her mom what had happened. They went to the police, and it was looked into, but because Caroline refused to testify against them, they were let go. They were given a 50-pound fine apiece and let go. I don't know what the specific charge for the fine was, but apparently they found something that they could stick, but it was just a fine, and they weren't able to arrest them and stop them at this time. In addition to the murders that were becoming routine with them, Rose was very abusive to the kids, much, much more than Fred was. The kids had repeated visits to the ER, but child social services, whatever they're called in England, they never picked up on it. They never investigated anything, and the kids were terrified to tell anybody what really happened. Their next victim was 19-year-old Linda Goff, and she was the girlfriend of one of the West's lodgers and would sometimes babysit for them. On April 13th, 1973, Linda moved in and became their full-time nanny. The West realized that she knew too much and that they were going to have to kill her. So they told people that they fired her and kicked her out. But her mother came to look for her, and her mother was told she had gone to Weston-super-Mare in Somerset, and they didn't know where she was at the time. Linda's mother realized that Rose was wearing Linda's slippers and saw some of Linda's clothes on the clothesline in the yard. Rosemary liked to keep the clothes of her victims and wear it. The next victim was 15-year-old Carol Cooper. She lived at a children's home and she was out going to the movies with friends and her boyfriend, and then they went to a pub. What's the drinking age in England? I thought a pub was a bar. Is pub a restaurant that has a bar attached, or is the drinking age lower in England? I don't know. I don't know a lot about England. I've always wanted to go. Let me know down in the comments if you know. She was last seen waiting at a bus stop, waiting for a bus to go visit her grandmother. The Wests found her and picked her up. It is unclear whether or not she went willingly, because they could have said, "Oh, we'll give you a ride to your grandma's," or if they actually kidnapped her. They took her home and they assayed her and they tortured her and then they hung her up. She was also dismembered and buried in the cellar. On December 27th, 21-year-old Lucy Partington was in her last year of college when she was waiting for a bus to go home for Christmas. The Wests picked her up and tortured her for a week. Fred killed and dismembered her just like all the others. But that day he went to the ER because he had a laceration on his right hand. They think that he cut his hand when he dismembered her because a knife, if you don't have a good guard on it, it will get slippery and your hand will slide down the knife and you will cut yourself. I think that laceration on his hand was from the dismemberment. In April of 1974, Teresa Seegathaler, I'm pretty sure I butchered that and I apologize, suffered the same fate. Fred decapitated her, which he sometimes did to make sure that they were really dead. He would also remove hands and feet to delay identification in case the bodies were found. In November of 1974, 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard suffered the same fate and was never seen again. She was picked up while she was waiting for the bus. 18-year-old Juanita Mott was an on-again, off-again boarder with the Wests. She had left home at the age of 15 and was living with a friend in Gloucestershire in 1975. She was last seen walking on the side of the road where the Wests picked her up and took her to the cellar. Fred was not on the police's radar for the murders. He was on the police's radar for all the burglary. Fred was not on the police's radar for the murders, but they were keeping an eye on him for his burglaries. He would use the money he stole for his home improvement projects in the cellar. Fred was charming and likable, and no one believed that he committed these horrible, horrible crimes. Rose was friendly as well, and she would befriend the women, but she was just as complicit as Fred was. In 1976, Rose met and befriended Miss A. I'm presuming that Miss A survived. That was the name she was given by the court to remain anonymous. She was living in a children's home as well because she had been essayed by her father and brother. So one day, Rose took her to the house and put her in a room where two girls were naked and tied up, and one of them was Anna Marie. They also made Anna Marie sleep with Rose's clients. Their next victim was 18-year-old Shirley Robinson. She was a friend of the Wests and a part-time lodger with them. She had an affair with Fred and became pregnant. And around the same time, Rosemary got pregnant by one of her clients. She was extremely jealous of Shirley and decided that she needed to go. Shirley was due in June of 78, and Rose killed her in May, never allowing Fred's baby to be born. She was the first victim to be buried in the backyard because he had put cement over the cellar floor. In 1979, Anne Marie got pregnant by Fred, and it resulted in an ectopic pregnancy. Now, an ectopic pregnancy is you've got the ovary and you have the uterus, and there's a tube that goes in between them. The egg comes out of the ovary, goes down the fallopian tube to the uterus. And sometimes an egg and a sperm will meet in the tube instead of for the sperm waiting, little anxious sperm waiting for the egg to come down, they will meet. And when that happens, that baby cannot develop. They can't grow. They cannot get nutrition. They cannot get oxygen because they have to be in the uterus in order for a placenta to form. And that is how they get their oxygen and their nutrients. And if they're in the tube, there's not enough room because it doesn't stretch like the uterus does, and they can't get the things they need to live. And if they grow and that tube ruptures, the woman could die. It's an emergency situation. They took Anna Marie to the hospital and they did the surgery. When she got home, Rose beat her just 2 days after this surgery that she had to have. And she was fed up and ran away. She said, "That's it. I'm done. I can't take it anymore." So after Anne Marie ran away, now Heather was the oldest in the house. And Heather started getting the brunt of the abuse. Now Heather was the oldest in the house and she became the target of the abuse. Their next victim was 16-year-old Allison Chambers. She became their babysitter and she suffered the same fate as everybody else. And that's all I could find on Allison Chambers. Heather was beaten by Fred and Rose, and she would get in trouble in school for not showering after PE because she didn't want anyone to see the bruises all over her body. She decided that she needed to get out of that house because Fred had tried to SA her just like he did the other girls, and she resisted him. And when she resisted him, he accused her of being a lesbian and then AR'd her anyway. And one night, Rose actually locked Heather and May and Steven outside in the snow for 3 hours. Heather decided she had got to get help from someone. And she told her friend Denise. And Denise told her parents. But her parents were friends with the Wests and said no, Heather is lying. They would never do that. So Heather looked for a job that would get her out of the house. And holiday camp, which I've never heard of that before. I don't know if it's a chain of hotels in England or if it's an actual camp. I don't know. But there was an opening for a cleaner and she would be able to live there and work there. And so she applied for that job, and when she got the call that she didn't get it, she was devastated and she cried for hours and hours and hours. On June 19th, 1987, the other kids came home from school and Heather was gone. And they asked Rosemary where she was, and Rosemary said, "Oh, she got that job at holiday camp, so she's going to be living there now." But if the kids disobeyed, this is what they heard: "You're going to end up buried just like Heather." So then in 1992, the abuse turned to Louise. And Louise told a friend who told her parents, but this time the parents believed her and they went to the police. A search warrant was executed on August 6, 1992, and they found sex toys, belts and buckles for bondage, and 99 pornographic tapes, both commercial and homemade. The Wests were arrested for R of a minor, and Rose was released on bail, but Fred was remanded, and the younger kids were put in a care home. 29-year-old Anna Marie, now married, was contacted by detectives. She told them everything. Anna Marie had also been looking for her sister Charmaine and her mother Rena with no success, and the detectives were trying to find Heather but were also unsuccessful. The trial began in 1993. Fred was charged with 3 counts of R, 1 count of burglary, and 1 count of cruelty to a child. Rose was charged with encouraging and inciting him to have sex with a child and cruelty to a child. But Anne Marie and Louise didn't want to testify, and the kids in the care homes were afraid to say anything. So Rose and Fred were acquitted. However, the younger kids still stayed in the care home, and the Wests were only allowed to have supervised visits with them. Hazel Savage was the deputy inspector assigned to the case, and she was convinced that something had happened to Heather and refused to let it go. A search warrant for the West property was issued on February 24th, 1994, and was executed on February 26th. Fred continued to insist that Heather was alive and well until he found out that they were digging the garden. Not only did he say that she was alive and well, she told them that she was mixed up with a drug cartel, and that's why nobody knew where she was. But when they started digging up the garden, he changed his story. He even told them they were digging in the wrong spot. The spot that they were digging in, Fred had told them there was no reason for that area to be searched. So, of course, they searched it, and they found 3 femurs. Femurs are your thigh bones, y'all. And they found 3 of them. And I don't know of anybody that has 3 legs. So they knew there had to be another victim that they had no clue about. So what Fred did was he told them, I will take you to where you need to dig for Heather. So they arranged to transport him, and he showed them exactly where he buried her, and they found a mass of bones, and they were able to confirm that it was Heather through dental ID. So he was charged with Heather's murder, and then they started questioning him about the 3rd femur. And if remember, the 3rd femur was found with 2 other femurs in a different spot. And what Fred said was that Shirley Robinson had rebuffed his advances, and she was a lesbian, and her lover was upset, and then he had to kill her and her lover in self-defense, and that's why there were 3 femurs in his yard. He was charged with both of those crimes the next day, and I am not sure who that second body belonged to, because he lied about her being a lesbian and having a lesbian lover, because this was the woman that fell in love with him and got pregnant that Rose killed. The police decided, after finding 3 femurs and then Heather in another grave, that they needed to search the entire property. Rose was put in a nearby safe house in another town. I don't know if that was because they were searching and they didn't want her in the way, or if there had been some threats against her because it got out what she had done. I'm not sure why, but she was put into a safe house while they were searching. And they found more bodies, and the bodies were missing bones, mostly fingers and toes. And Fred would not tell them where the other bones were or why they were not with the bodies. Between the 5th and 8th of March, 6 more young women were found at 25 Cromwell Street. All of the bodies showed extreme SA before their death. On April 20th, 1994, Rosemary was arrested for the SA of an 11-year-old girl and the assault of an 8-year-old boy in the 70s. She was refused bail and transferred to Puck Church Prison. She was questioned about the murders of Heather and Linda Goff, and on April 25th, she was officially charged with Linda's murder. By May 6th, Fred and Rosemary were jointly charged with 5 counts of murder. Rose replied, I'm innocent to every count. Fred agreed to ID each burial location, and they were unearthed between April 10th and June 7th. He was then transferred to HM Prison, Buckingham, where he was put on suicide watch and his cell was checked every 15 minutes. So when someone is put on suicide watch, as a nurse, I would have to do suicide watch on people, and that was the easiest shift of any. That's so bad. But it really was. I worked night shift. That was the easiest shift I ever worked. Stephen King had just come out with a book. I don't remember which one it was, but I had that book with me to read on my lunch break. And they said, "Oh, we're going to float you to the psych floor." And my first thought was, "Oh, crap. No, you're not." But then all it was there was a young man that had tried to commit suicide and he was hospitalized. And all I had to do was sit in a chair by his bed, and there was a sheet of paper. Every 15 minutes, I had just to initial that he was fine. And all he did was sleep all night long. And I didn't have to document anything other than just at this 15-minute interval, I had to put my initials. And I sat there and I read a Stephen King book all night long. The easiest shift ever. I don't know about in a jail. I don't know how their suicide watches work. I didn't have to wake him up. But also, I'm a nurse, so I'm qualified to tell if somebody's alive and well or not. And so I don't know how that works in the prison system. I don't know if they actually have to wake him up and speak to him every 15. That would suck. Oh my God, that would so suck. The final charges for Fred were 12 murders. Rose was 9 murders. Rose visibly flinched when Fred tried to touch her in court. And from some of the sources, it says that they kind of thought that this was a show, that this was put on for her to distance herself from Fred even more, so it was be plausible that she had no involvement. They were both held without bail, and Fred resisted when the guards tried to take him back to jail. And he tried to get to Rose, and Rose visibly flinched and writhed away from his grasp. And after Rose rejected him, he withdrew his claim that Rose was innocent, saying that she helped with all of the murders with the exception of Anne McFall, who he claimed Rena killed. He killed Anna McFall because she was pregnant with his child, and he didn't want her or the baby. Rena did not kill her. They relaxed the suicide watch, and on January 1st, 1995, he hung himself in his cell. And his suicide note was a love letter to Rosemary. Rosemary pleaded not guilty to 10 murders. They added Charmaine's murder on. The pre-trial proceedings started in February, and the charges for the assaults of the little kids, of the 8-year-old and the 11-year-old, were dropped. Her trial started on October 3rd, 1995. Okay, this says the final defense witness. Now, I don't know why this woman would be a defense witness for Rosemary, and I also don't understand the need for her to be a witness at all. Her name was Janet Leach, and she was Fred's appropriate adult. I've never heard that term before in conjunction with a legal case. In America, we have guardian ad litems, and I'm thinking that is a similar thing. If there is a minor who doesn't have involved parents, or their parents are being investigated for something they did to that child, they have a guardian ad litem, and that just means a responsible person. It can be a family member, it can be a social worker, and so basically that, I believe, is what an appropriate adult is. I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it says parent, guardian, or social worker, if not available, any responsible person over 18. And they must be called when a child or vulnerable adult is detained or interviewed. Now, in America, a vulnerable adult would be somebody that had Down syndrome or cerebral palsy or that their mind is not an adult mind, even though their body is an adult body. So that's the only reason why I would think an appropriate adult would be needed, because even though Fred had 2 head injuries, I do not consider him a vulnerable adult. But maybe that's different in England. Again, I don't know British customs. If you do and you want to let me know down in the comments, I would be pleased to read it. Wikipedia also defines vulnerable adult as a person with mental or functional impairment. Because he had 2 head injuries as a young person, he gets this appropriate adult. So I don't really consider him a vulnerable adult, but apparently in England, because of the head injuries, he was considered a vulnerable adult. Janet Leach testified at Rosemary's trial, and in the research, I saw that it said she was a defense witness, but it doesn't make sense because, unless I'm just completely misunderstanding it, she testified on November 7th, and it was to rebut Fred's confession that Rose knew nothing about the murders. So if she's going to get up there and say, oh no, Rose did it with him, it's not going to help Rose. So I don't know. I think that was a mistake. I think she was a witness for the prosecution. But at any rate, she testified that he and Rosemary, the night before their arrest, because they knew it was coming, that they had made a pact. He would confess to everything and tell them that she had absolutely no involvement whatsoever. Rosemary was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and she is now 68 years old and in prison at HMP Low Newton, Brasside, Durham. So that's it on Fred and Rosemary West, and I am so glad because I don't want to ever have to think about these people again. I feel like I need to go take a shower. Ugh. So, next week, Season 1, Episode 15 of Criminal Minds, Unfinished Business, and we will be discussing BTK, Dennis Rader. Bye, y'all. Remember, be kind to people, love your family, and I'll see you next time. Bye.